Hello, this is Matt Pullin, and this chess video is part of my Stonewall Legacy series, in which we look at the challenges Black can put up to White's intended Stonewall setup. And today we're going to look at something which I'm calling the Baltic Defense, because it looks like the Baltic defense to the Queen's Gambit, bishop to f5. And one of Black's ideas here is if White captures on d5, Black will take the knight on its original square, because after queen takes, there's no knight that can come to c3 to attack the black queen, and in addition, White needs to do something about his a-pawn. So keep this in mind as we look at the variations which we're going to see today in the Baltic defense to the Stonewall, bishop to f5 immediately. I think that this is a pretty interesting response to the Stonewall because White's point is he wants to have piece control over the light squares, and it's difficult to do so after bishop to d3 because Black will trade on d3 and queen takes, and now the threat is queen b5 check, winning the b7 pawn, so Black needs to play c6 to stop that check. And now White needs to play e4 to make his position work because he is a bad bishop on c1. So if e4 right away, then it just loses a tempo to knight f6. So after f3, for instance, to capture back on e4 with a pawn, Black can play e6, and if e4, then queen to b6. And the idea is, after any white move, like say e5 or knight c3, Black will play queen a6 and challenge White's control over this light square diagonal from a6 to f1. So this position, I feel, is more or less completely equal. So it is a bad idea to allow this trade of bishops on light squares for White. Instead, I think that the best plan when Black puts the bishop on f5 is to play c4 to transpose into a queen's gambit-like position, where White will play queen b3 early to attack the b7 pawn. For instance, if Black plays e6, a move which he would like to play, followed up by c6, knight f6, etc., then White will play queen b3. And now Black has to make a concession in order to guard b7. b6 creates very significant weaknesses on light squares on Black's queen side, and the bishop, the guardian of the light squares, is out on f5. So White has a positional advantage here because of the weakness of Black's queen side. If queen to c8, guarding the pawn, then just White wins a pawn on d5. So captures on c4 first. This guards the pawn on b7 without making a concession. But after knight c3, it's clear that White has an advantage in pawn control of the center, and he will play pawn e3 to e4 with advantage. For instance, knight f6, f3, followed by e4 to gain time on the bishop. So this is also a significant advantage for White. So e6 is not a very good move. I think a better move is c6. And this leads to a position that can be reached through the Slav: d4, d5, c4, c6, e3, bishop f5. And that's how this position is reached most of the time. So in this position, the obvious queen b3 is not quite good enough for an advantage because of queen to b6. Now the queens are in a face-off like this, and when your queens are in a face-off on b3 and b6, usually you don't want to be the one to make the capture because the capture will open up your opponent's a-file. For instance, queen takes b6, and now a takes b6. Opening up the black rook, and White would like to give his opponent two double isolated b-pawns. So he can play pawn takes pawn, but instead of taking back, Black can play bishop takes knight. And now rook takes a2, pawn takes, and this is equal. In fact, I like black a little bit more because of his rook position on the 7th and his better pawn structure. So instead of doing that, white would need to prevent the capture, and then black plays e6 and he's fine. So on queen b6, let's say white captures on d5, and this forces black to take back with the queen, because this just loses a pawn, so instead black has to take on b3, and now a takes, and bishop takes b1 is really pointless now because there's no open file for the rook, so black just captures back, and now knight c3, and black guards the pawn, and then knight b5 threatening knight c7, and now king to d7 to guard that move. And even though white can win a pawn here with rook takes, knight takes, this position is equal because firstly black can get his pieces out a lot faster than white can get his pieces out. His king is in a centralized position, and the extra pawn that white has is a doubled isolated b pawn. So even though white has won a pawn in this position, in practice this endgame is difficult for white to win. So really white can get an advantage out of the immediate queen b3, but it's probably not a good enough advantage. So instead, there's an interesting move, knight to c3, and then if e6, then queen to b3. And this, I think black can play queen to c7 here because there's no way for white to attack black's queen, because the c file is partially blocked by the white pieces. And black will just play his knight out to f3, and black develops normally in this line. So that is also kind of equal. I think the best move for white is to play pawn takes pawn. And now there are 3 captures that black has, 2 of which are good. Bishop takes b1, the Baltic-like response. Rook takes, queen takes, a3 to guard the a pawn. And now I believe e5 is a little bit premature because of pawn takes. And now the queen can capture back on e5, but then white just develops with tempo. Or queen can take d1, forcing white to move his king, but now it's going to be hard for black to regain the pawn on e5. So e5 is a little premature. Knight d7 is probably best. If knight e2 with the intention of going to c3, now black can get away with e5. So knight to f3 is probably best instead, preventing that freeing move. And now knight to f6, queen c2, e6, bishop d3, bishop to e7. And now this is a slight advantage for white because he has more pawn control over the center. But this is sort of like a Scandinavian where defensively black has pawns on e6 and c6, but the bad bishop has been traded away. So I think that this is the best position that white can achieve in the bishop f5 line. If instead black captures with the pawn on d5, then queen to b3 is a good move. Black answers queen to c7 because the counter threat on the bishop on c1 prevents white from taking on d5. So white has this bishop check, which is actually quite strong because if knight c6, then white wins a pawn. So knight to d7, and now bishop to d2. And now black needs to do something about the pawn. Knight f3, knight f6, and castles. And white's idea is to play rook f1 to c1 to gain control over the c-file, because the black queen is sitting there and there's nothing that can block. So this is the idea. That's why white delayed the development of the knight on b1. So this, I believe, is a significant advantage for white, because not only can he contest the c-file, but he can play bishop d2 to b4 to trade off for black's bishop, so his bad bishop is not really a problem here. So these are some ideas in the bishop f5 line against the Stonewall, where I think that white should switch plans with c4, and if black plays c6, I believe that white should capture immediately on d5. So we will discuss other attempts at fighting the Stonewall in future videos in this series. Thank you for watching.